So the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth Material Ultimania has officially been released, and there's a few interesting tidbits that have come out from that book that I think are worth talking about and revisiting. And we're also going to take a look at the 2024 reception to a wonderful game like Rebirth as viewed by Kyle Bosman, and he has some really interesting takes on this game that I think we can all kind of relate to. So we're going to take a look at both of those things in today's video, and if any of that sounds cool to you, you guys know what to do by now. So starting off first with that Ultimania, we do have to make some clarifications. There are two types of Ultimanias. There's the standard Ultimania, which we got one for Rebirth earlier this year, and those tend to include the juicier, bigger story things. Developers elaborating on cutscenes, fueling the flames of theories and confusion, while also kind of clarifying some things. They're incredible, they have tons of information, they're super fun. Now there's also material Ultimanias, and from my understanding and research, those focus more on the artwork of the video game. So CG renders, character models, enemies, locations, with some developer interviews here and there, but nothing super significant and juicy in regards to the story stuff. So I don't anticipate bigger story things coming out of this book within the next week or so, but there are some interesting things to talk about. And to do that, we're going to pull from Audrey on Twitter, who has translated some of the more interesting aspects of the book and made them available online for us to look at. So starting off first, we have the cover art for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which is really beautiful. I would love to see this in a metallic finish. The colors I think would really pop, but that features Cloud, Sephiroth, and Zack standing in Nibelheim. So Audrey goes on to write, Rebirth Material Ultimania artist comment says the official art concept was that Cloud, Sephiroth, and Zack are standing in separate world axes of Nibelheim. The red and ominous sky represents Sephiroth, and they revised it many times to get it just right. And I genuinely really love this cover art because it does connect with the characters and it does connect with the story. If you look at Zack, his side of this cover art is much more beautiful. Some would say fair skies, kind of representing his outlook on things. Zack is a much more positive kind of individual. And then the other side of the spectrum, you've got Cloud, who is also standing in Nibelheim, but he's under a night sky that is much cloudier. And I don't think that's just because his name is Cloud, like Zack would be with the fair skies. That has a lot to do with Cloud as a character. His mind is literally cloudy. We know he doesn't have all of his proper memories in place, so he's really kind of struggling with his identity, which again, that fits the character of Cloud. And then you've got Sephiroth in the middle, the guy who is standing in between both of them, the guy who literally separates them at the end of the game when they're fighting together, and his sky is red. Dark, there's some lightning there, and I think that represents Meteor. So in part 3, when Meteor gets summoned, I think that's what a lot of the world might end up looking like in some locations, is that red, orange, ominous kind of sky. It's beautiful, and I can't wait to see it. Next up, this is super fascinating, and this has to do with the character of Glenn from the First Soldier story in Ever Crisis. Audrey goes on to write, lead character modeling artist Saikai says when designing Glenn Lodbrok for First Soldier, they received word his character might also appear in the 7 Remake project, and designed him based on his role in the story and how different he would look compared to his younger self. They're excited to see how Glenn will be involved with the remake story from here on out. So that first part we knew, Glenn was designed specifically for Ever Crisis, and then he got yoinked from that game to put into the remake trilogy. Now what's interesting is that final line is that the developers are excited to see how Glenn plays out in the rest of the remake trilogy, implying that he's gonna come back. Which is fascinating because having played through Rebirth, we know that the real Glenn Lodbrok, spoilers, again, this video is going to be filled with them, we know that the real Glenn is dead. Rufus shoots him in the back, presumably in Wutai, murdering him. Glenn is unfortunately gone, which is really sad because playing through some aspects of Ever Crisis and watching some of the cutscenes and chapters, Glenn seems like a genuinely cool character. He's fun, he's lighthearted, he's a little bit of a himbo at times, but the reason that he and his friends Matt and Lucia joined Shinra was to help people. And the more they work for Shinra, they realize we're not helping anyone. We're effectively just doing more harm than anything, which causes them to defect from Shinra. Now, Matt and Lucia are still mentioned in the story. They're still a part of the bigger cell of Avalanche, but unfortunately, again, Glenn is dead. And when we see Glenn show up in Rebirth, it's confusing because he's acting way different than I remembered him to be in Ever Crisis. And we would eventually learn that the Glenn we're seeing in Rebirth is not actually Glenn. It's a Sephiroth clone masquerading as Glenn to mess with Rufus, which I genuinely really loved. It takes a lot to shake a character like Rufus to his core, but for him to see essentially the man that he was certain he shot and killed show up in his office room and talk to him about the deal with Wutai and the war and what's going on really does throw him for a loop, which is great. But you're probably wondering, if Glenn is dead and the Glenn we saw in Rebirth isn't actually Glenn, how can he show back up in part 3? And I think the way you do it is two things. More Sephiroth clones masquerading as Glenn, but also flashbacks. We do know that Yuffie knows who Glenn is. General Lodbrok, as she called him, shows up in Wutai and helps them create that revolution to free Wutai and its people. So once we get to Wutai in part 3, I wouldn't be shocked if there are flashbacks where Yuffie kind of recalls the events of how that revolution came to be. We see her interactions with Glenn. We see Glenn helping the people of Wutai, maybe even participating in some battles to help save her home. So I think including Glenn in that fashion via flashbacks will probably happen, but you could also, again, have him show back up through the form of the Sephiroth clone, maybe to mess with Yuffie a little bit, maybe to kind of spy on the party, get some intel. It's super fascinating. There's so many things that they can do with Glenn, or the image of Glenn, so to speak, when it comes to the narrative and how he's affecting the other characters. There is another rumor going around as well that Glenn might be Cloud's father. They do look very similar. They have similar hair, facial features, whatnot, although Cloud definitely more resembles his mom. I think that's not the case. I don't know how I would feel if it was the case, but I think some fans out there have run the numbers and looked at timelines, and it wouldn't match up with Cloud's age and when Cloud's mom, Claudia, met her, husband, the father of Cloud. It's all murky. What I'm saying is I don't think Glenn is going to be Cloud's dad. Up next, we have some details on the CG renders of Sephiroth, where Audrey writes, Rebirth layout artist Honda says for this CG render of Sephiroth, since he shows a kinder side in the game, they designed this pose so it looks like he's going in for a handshake, but then morphs into him inviting you to a reunion, which really fits the end of 7 Remake. He offers his hand to Cloud. He's like, join me, Cloud. Let us defy that darn destiny together. And speaking on the more friendlier aspects of Sephiroth, I love it. I think he's being voiced brilliantly by Tyler Hoechlin, who also recently just wrapped up Superman and Lois. That show officially ended. It's phenomenal. He is probably my favorite incarnation of Superman / Clark Kent we've ever gotten, right up there with Christopher Reeve. He's phenomenal. That show is great. If you like Superman or have a passing interest in it, I highly recommend it. But hearing Tyler get to perform the friendlier pre-snap sicko mode Sephiroth, I think is lovely. He's got a little bit of a sense of humor. He's obviously very stoic, but he's able to kind of joke around and have fun. There's the moment at the beginning of the game where Cloud is leading the group trying to find a path through Nibelheim, and he ends up reaching a dead end, and Tifa corrects him like, no, we got to go this way. That place has been out of commission for a while. And Sephiroth jokes like, man, if we had let you be the guide, you would have run us off a cliff, which I thought was pretty funny. But just seeing him be a good guy, hearing that change in his voice, seeing how helpful he was, how kind he was, it makes him becoming a bad guy even more powerful, I feel, and it makes it more heartbreaking because it's like, man, this guy could have been something if he was still a good guy. The good he could have done, who knows what would have happened, but he's become such an iconic villain because of that backstory and what's happened to him. And oddly enough, I think my favorite line delivery from Tyler in that section of the game is after you fight the Materia Guardian, and he just goes up to Cloud and says, nice work.
Nice work.
In the way he says, nice work, I'm just like, that's so cool, man. It's a simple line delivery, but that just kind of hits home that at one point Sephiroth was kind of a regular guy with some oddities to him. Now up next, we talk about one of the biggest moments in Rebirth. Again, spoiler alert, but that's how they depicted the death of Aerith. And the devs go on to talk about how storyboarding that section of the game was actually kind of difficult. So Audrey goes on to write, Rebirth lead story artist Takarada said the important scene where Sephiroth falls from the sky in that scene was extremely difficult to make. The concept was, could Cloud intercept Sephiroth falling from the sky or not? Takarada notes it was especially difficult to create a scene showing the the different perceptions of the situation. One from Cloud's POV and the other from the other members. Which again, the ending section of that game is meant to be confusing. But if it's confusing as players watching it, I can't imagine how difficult it was to kind of put that all together, because you've got the aspect of, did Cloud save Aerith? And then there's the aspect of, no, he clearly did not save Aerith. She's dead as a doornail at this point. But having to depict that from Cloud's perspective, from Tifa's perspective, from Barrett's perspective, and even to a degree Sephiroth, because he clearly knows what's going on here. And the reason why I wanted to bring this one up is we have covered this scene in particular ad nauseum on this channel, but there are a lot of new people who have come to my channel and have subscribed, and I don't expect everyone to go back and watch every bit of video I've ever created. That would be torture, and I would not ask anyone to do that. So for those of you who have been around for a while, I'm gonna sound like a broken record, so I apologize, but I brought this up because I looked at the comments to this tweet, and a majority of them were pretty negative. And again, there's a lot of people that do not like the ending of Rebirth, that scene in particular, which again, I'm totally fine with, and I can understand why people don't like that scene and how it's depicted. And the biggest thing I kept seeing in those comments was people talking about they ruined Aerith's death, the impact is gone, we no longer feel that sense of loss. And I agree to a certain degree. Now again, I love the ending, I love how it's depicted, I love the questions that it raises. As far as loss goes, I still feel like you feel loss in that section of the game, but it's now in a different spot. And it's in the section where Cloud and Aerith are in the alternate world going on their date, which leads them to the church in the slums where Aerith effectively says goodbye to Cloud, that version of Aerith. That's the last time she's ever going to see him again. And she realizes in that moment, this is my final time to say goodbye, to say what he means to me, to try and, push him in a direction where he's going to be okay and recover. And I think even one of the NPCs in that scene states that Cloud and Aerith don't look like they're on a date, they look like they're at a funeral, which again is what's happening. So when Aerith says goodbye and she pushes Cloud into that portal, it's incredibly sad and it's heartbreaking because we know what is going to happen within the next few sections of that scene. We just don't see it. So that feeling of loss is still there. It's just in a completely different spot now. Now, in regards to the death of Aerith and them not showing it in full properly, again, I think that's the whole point with the narrative this time around. We all know she's dead. We all know how impactful that moment is. And so do the devs. And again, I tend to be one of the more optimistic, positive people within the Final Fantasy community. I'm very open-minded when it comes to what the devs are doing, and I do trust in their vision because I played Remake, I played Rebirth, I've covered tons of dev interviews that show to me that they understand these characters, the world, the overall story, especially those big story moments. And they wouldn't sacrifice the death of Aerith for nothing. If they're doing that, it's to hammer home a bigger moment in part 3. So by sacrificing that complete section of Aerith and her death to save it for part 3, I think is pretty important. And again, in part 3, I think it's going to lead to that moment where we get that big cathartic release, but we also feel that pain of knowing, yeah, Aerith is dead, and now Cloud has to come to terms with her being dead. So all the story stuff is still there, it's still intact, it's just going to be told in slightly different ways, it's going to be rearranged, and the developers know that. And to kind of reinforce that, we're going to jump over to the Shinra Archaeology Department over on Twitter, who pulled from an interview that Katase did with Push Square back in 2020, where he talks about finding a balance between doing something new and staying true to the original. So Katase would go on to say, I personally envisioned quite a dramatic change overall, but our director, Tetsuya Nomura, and co-director Naoki Hamaguchi wanted to keep the beloved aspects in the original as much as possible. Eventually, the dev team decided to focus on respecting the original while adding in new elements, ensuring a delicate balance between the two. So they clearly know what they're doing, and all the big story stuff is still gonna be there. They're just rearranging how it appears within the game. And as far as that big cathartic moment in part 3, I've been saying this, people like Maximilian Dude have been hammering this home as well, and I think he's 100% on the nose when it comes to this. We're gonna have a moment in part 3, probably when Cloud and Tifa are in the live stream and she's helping him put his memories back and he becomes the real Cloud. And it's this really big joyous moment, but it's gonna kind of be punctuated with that grief and that sadness that's going to hit Cloud in real time, because now he and us as the player are finally going to see what happened to Aerith in full. We're going to hear that speech from Cloud, which according to Cody Christian, he did record that dialogue already. We just haven't heard it. We're going to see that blade stab Aerith. We're going to see the blood. We're going to see him pick her up and carry her into the water. He's going to have to come to terms with the fact that Aerith is gone. You have to accept that she's gone. And I think that it was Maximilian dude who came up with this idea, but in that moment, Aerith will probably show up to Cloud and they will have a heart-to-heart, leading to that cathartic release where she tells Cloud, you did everything you could for me. None of this is your fault. You did the best you could. Let all of that grief go. What's weighing you down, let it go. And I think what could make this even sweeter is including Tifa there. Again, Tifa has experience with the live stream now. She's probably going to see things that the other characters might not see too, because she fell into the live stream. So if she's there helping Cloud put his memories together, and if she can kind of maybe be in on that moment between Cloud and Aerith, and they all just kind of share a heart-to-heart with one another, I think that could be really cool. And I think it's going to be way more impactful of a moment than if we just saw the same thing play out in Rebirth. Oh, Aerith's dead, she's gone, we hear the speech from Cloud. It's still sad, but I think the way that they're doing it, sacrificing that big moment for a bigger payoff in part 3, I think if done well, could be an incredible moment within the franchise. And again, I do think they're gonna nail the landing. I just happen to be, again, more optimistic, more open-minded about these things. I'm a jar 2/3 full kind of guy. That's who I am. I tend to be more optimistic on this stuff, and I think that part 3 is going to probably be the best of the bunch, and I think narrative-wise, it's going to really hit people in the stomach, in your heart, in your farts. It's going to break you up inside. It's going to beat you down. It's going to step all over you. It's going to poop on you. It's going to make you feel awful, but in the best way possible, because after that, you get that release. And other than the ending and Aerith's death, another criticism I see from fans is the marketing aspect of the game and the story of Remake, giving players that hope that, hey, maybe we can change destiny and actually save Aerith. But what's the point of all of that if she's just gonna die anyway? And I think that is the point. Sephiroth in particular, if we're going down that meta route, wants to give Cloud and the party and the player hope that, hey, maybe she'll survive. But at the end of the day, she doesn't. She dies. What better way for Sephiroth as a character to get his jollies off than to implant that seed into Cloud in the player's head of, hey, you might be able to save her, just to have that not be the case. Which falls in line with both Cloud and Sephiroth as characters. Both of these characters have trouble accepting fate. Sephiroth in Ever Crisis wanting to save people and not being able to. Also potentially Sephiroth not being able to accept that he's just destined to be defeated in every single world. And with Cloud, he eventually has to accept that death is a part of life, like Aerith in this story has been hammering home for quite some time now. He has to get over that denial and just accept that that is what happens. Because if he cannot accept that, he's no different than Sephiroth. Which again, I really love this stuff. Now, to end the video, we're going to jump over to Kyle Bosman's page on YouTube, who talked briefly about Rebirth in his latest upload, the top 5 harsh realizations of 2024 from his show Delayed Input. Now, if you don't know who Kyle Bosman is, you gotta familiarize yourself with Kyle. He's brilliant. He's been in the industry for quite some time. I believe he got his start over at Game Trailers doing the Final Bossman and working with that team over there. They then became Easy Allies, and he's now on his own doing his show Delayed Input and also streaming on Twitch. But Kyle is such a unique voice within the gaming sphere, and the way that he's able to break down even news articles or sections from games in a way that is so funny and easily digestible, but also very poignant. And he's got a real way with analogies that are brilliant. I wish I could make content a quarter as good as Kyle. But I wanted to bring up this video that he released because one of his harsh realizations was maybe Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is unpopular. Now again, that title that he uses is a little bit more dramatic and hyperbolic, and he would admit to that as well. But he's not wrong. He analyzes when 7 Remake came out, and that came out during the pandemic, and I've echoed this same statement before too, is 7 Remake is fantastic. It sold really well, and I think part of that reason is A, it's the first in the trilogy, so it's introducing everyone again to Remake and the 7 universe, but it also benefited from that COVID bump. Everyone was at home, playing games, watching movies. You had to have something to keep you busy. And there's so many things within that era of our world that really benefited from that lockdown, Remake being one of them. And when Rebirth came out, and it, obviously we've covered this as a lot too, it didn't sell as well, or it didn't meet the expectations that Square Enix had, which again, when it comes to sales goals for these companies, they tend to have many internal sales goals. And from my understanding, Rebirth did reach some of those goals. It just didn't reach that super high one that Square Enix had. So the game is probably fine by now. It's probably sold at least maybe 4 million, maybe 5 million units. We don't have a concrete number. But he goes on to essentially talk about the game in the way that we all talk about it, and that's, we love it. It's an incredibly special, incredible game that came out within this year that felt like it was impossible. It's a phenomenal game. So I'll go ahead and play a snippet from his video to give you guys a better understanding of how he feels about this game.
7 Rebirth, for me, though, felt like the payoff. The fulfillment of the promise made all those years ago. Probably the most bleeding edge, weirdest, sincerest, coolest, dorky game I've ever played. An unfathomable achievement. I didn't think video games like this could be built. So imagine my sick surprise when I log online and see that it is not met with universal praise. Imagine my dark, pitiful tears when I saw that some people dared to prefer Metaphor ReFantasio. Why can't they see what I see?
And I feel like he's right. Again, I haven't played Metaphor. I hear it's really good. I've watched a decent amount of gameplay on it, and while I was really fascinated at first, the more I kind of watch it and learn about it, I kind of lose a little bit of interest, and I don't think it'd be a game that's for me. I'm very picky as I age when it comes to the games that I play. I gotta pick a game that I'm sure about, instead of just kind of taking a chance on it. And Kyle does have a little bit of a beef with Metaphor, and granted, he did actually give the game a chance. He played it, at least some of it, but he just was not pulled in by that game, so he stopped playing it. And on the Easy Allies podcast, he actually made a joke, which I don't even think is really a joke. He was being pretty honest, but he was genuinely stunned that at the Game Awards this year, a game like Metaphor beat Rebirth in the Best RPG and Best Narrative category. And there was another panelist on that episode of the Easy Allies podcast who played Metaphor. She played it all the way through, Gabby, and she loved it. She thought it was great, but even she's like, no, I don't think this should win Best Narrative. And Kyle would then go on to jokingly, but I think also kind of seriously say, for everyone who voted for Metaphor to win Best RPG at the Game Awards, he's willing to accept your apology on January 23rd. For not voting for Rebirth. What happens on the 23rd of January? Rebirth officially releases on PC, which means more people are going to play it. More people might go, oh, I probably should have voted for Rebirth to win Best RPG over Metaphor. But it's all fun and games, you like what you like. I just really appreciate the kind of snarkier side that Kyle Bosman has. But I just thought that was super interesting because, again, we cover Final Fantasy primarily on this channel, and I see a wide array of opinions on Rebirth, especially that ending. Some people loved the game. Some people were like, it just feels like filler. It didn't really pull me in. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. And I wanted to bring this part of the video up in particular to kind of look at the Game Awards. But I think it's really interesting that if you look at the Game Awards in particular, I think when it comes to Jeff's event, Final Fantasy is, to borrow the phrase, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. And what do I mean by that? Well, Final Fantasy games come out, they get nominated for a bunch of awards at Jeff's event, they win Best Music, and that's it. They never win Game of the Year, they never win Best Game Direction, or a majority of the other awards, they just usually get music. But what's really interesting is that if you look outside of the sphere of Jeff's event, a lot of other award shows and publications are awarding Rebirth their Game of the Year, as well as things like Best Narrative, Best Direction, Best Performances, Best Soundtrack. Places like the Golden Joystick Awards, Rebirth did really well. Gaming Bible, Game Rant, I think IGN's even awarded Rebirth some pretty big awards. USA Today, which I didn't even know had a gaming section, awarded Rebirth their Game of the Year. Inverse awarded it their Game of the Year. So many of these bigger publications outside of the Game Awards really showed a lot of love to Rebirth, and I think that game really connected with them. And I just think that's really fascinating how the outside of the Game Awards seem to really love and appreciate Rebirth, but within the Game Awards and Jeff's event, there's definitely more of a push towards something like Astrobot, which again, phenomenal game. I get why they would vote for Astrobot to kind of send a message to the industry, but at the same time, the message being sent of this is a really fun, original game that doesn't have microtransactions or live service things, came out of nowhere. It was made with passion by a development team that clearly appreciated and loved what they were doing, and look how well it did. And I feel like you could apply that to Rebirth as well. Yeah, it's part of a remake trilogy, but all of the dev interviews we've watched and covered on this channel, they really show how much they love and appreciate these characters, this world, this story, the gameplay mechanics. It's also a game that doesn't have DLC, doesn't have microtransactions or weird kind of live service elements to it. It's just a phenomenal, somewhat standalone game that I think is pretty special. And being always the bridesmaid, never the bride, I think is just kind of the situation that Final Fantasy as a franchise will forever be in when it comes to the Game Awards. Part 3 could come out and be the best of the trilogy, being phenomenal game, one of the best ever made, and unfortunately I still think it probably won't win Game of the Year at Jeff's event. There's going to be some other game that comes out that just kind of steals its thunder, or the journalists tend to lean towards. That's just kind of how my thought process is going at the moment. But I hope I'm wrong. And I took the scenic route there, but the whole point is I do agree with Kyle in the fact that Rebirth probably, at least at the beginning of the year, wasn't very popular, but just kind of seeing the love and adoration that it's getting from other award shows says to me that maybe the game is starting to pick up some steam, pun intended, and hopefully with the release of the PC version, more people are willing to give it a shot, and it's got some legs, and more people can see how great the game is, which Kyle echoes towards the end of his video as well. So I just thought that was a really fascinating video and take from Kyle. I'll leave a link to Kyle's channel in the description below for you guys to check it out. I highly recommend you subscribe. He's got some really great takes on the gaming industry as a whole that I think is super fascinating, entertaining, but also informative. Now, with that being said, that is the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think so far of some of these tidbits that are coming from the material, Ultimania for Rebirth, and what was your overall reception to Rebirth? I know it's kind of all over the place with the hardcore fans, but I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.